Long before Dan Ariely ever stepped into a lab or designed an experiment, life forced him into a world where pain, expectation, and logic refused to match. He was a teenager when a freak explosion left most of his body burned. Doctors wrapped and unwrapped his skin every day, convinced that removing bandages quickly was the rational way to reduce suffering. Quick pain, less total agony, that was their belief. But to the boy lying on the bed, time didn't behave like math. A fast rip didn't feel merciful. It felt violent, sharp, unforgettable. A slower removal wasn't painless, but it gave the mind space to breathe. Their reasoning was neat. Reality wasn't. That experience became a seed, a quiet question that would grow for years. What if the way people think the mind works is completely different from how it actually works? When he healed, he didn't walk away with bitterness. He walked away with curiosity, not about pain but about the invisible gap between what humans believe and what they really do. That curiosity followed him into classrooms, labs, everyday life, and eventually into the experiments that would expose something uncomfortable and strangely beautiful about human nature. We are not rational creatures who occasionally make mistakes. We are predictably irrational creatures who believe we are rational. The first clue came not from philosophy but from chocolate. Ariely set up a simple table. On it, 2 kinds of chocolate. One was cheap, the kind you'd find in a discount bin. The other was a rich, premium truffle that normally cost far more. But he made the prices absurdly low. One cost a single coin, the other cost a few cents more. Most people chose the premium chocolate, because it was clearly the better deal. Then he changed just one thing, he made the cheaper chocolate free. Suddenly, logic evaporated. Almost everyone chose the free candy, even though the premium chocolate still offered far more value for just a tiny cost. The word free didn't lower the price. It erased thought. That was the moment the pattern became undeniable. People don't choose based on value. They choose based on feeling. And nothing feels more tempting than something that costs nothing. The same irrational pull showed up again when Ariely tested how people respond to anchors, the first number or idea presented to them. Ask someone if the population of a country is more or less than 10 million, and their mind clings to that number like a magnet. Their final guess revolves around it even if the real number is nowhere near it. Change the anchor and you change the answer, without ever changing the facts. Humans don't start from logic. They start from whatever happened to appear first. But the experiment that truly exposed the mind's strange wiring wasn't about candy or numbers. It was about ownership, the way simply possessing something changes how we value it. Ariely tested this with basketball game tickets. Students who randomly won a ticket refused to sell it for less than hundreds of dollars. Students who didn't win it refused to buy it for more than $20 or $30. Same ticket. Same seat. Same game. The only difference was one illusion: mine. The moment something becomes ours, the brain wraps it in emotional force fields, inflating its worth, not because the object changed but because identity attached itself to it. The mind doesn't value objects. It values stories, especially the ones where we are the owner, the chooser, the hero. That was the turning point. The experiments weren't revealing stupidity. They were revealing design. Humans weren't failing to think rationally, they were thinking in a way that served survival, ego, emotion, comparison, and memory long before logic was ever invented. We compare everything. We justify what benefits us. We follow the invisible pull of free. We trust first impressions more than evidence. We cling to what we own even when it hurts us. We cheat a little, just enough to still feel honest. And the most striking part? None of this feels irrational while it's happening. It feels natural, comfortable, correct. That's where Ariely's mission began, not to laugh at irrationality but to map it. If irrational behavior is predictable, then maybe, just maybe, we could learn to see it before it controls us. The experiments that followed weren't done in sterile labs with emotionless charts. They were disguised inside ordinary life. Coffee shop choices, subscription offers, pain treatments, pricing tricks, romantic decisions, moral shortcuts. Each one revealed another invisible lever, another hidden script the mind follows without permission or awareness. Because the truth isn't that humans make bad decisions. The truth is that we think we're making free decisions, when most of the time something else is already choosing for us. And the most shocking part? That something isn't outside us. It's our own mind. The deeper Ariely explored human decision-making, the more he realized irrationality wasn't random. It was patterned, structured, almost choreographed. It didn't appear in dramatic life decisions first. It hid in tiny, seemingly harmless moments. A discount, a comparison, a guess, a limited offer, a feeling that something was a good deal even when it wasn't. The mind didn't just make mistakes, it made the same mistakes again and again as if following a script it didn't know it was reading. One of the strongest examples of that script appeared in the experiment that became famous for exposing the decoy effect. Ariely offered people 3 subscription choices to a magazine. One was a cheap digital-only version, one was a more expensive print-only version, and the third option offered both print and digital for the same price as the print-only version. Almost nobody chose print-only. But that wasn't the point. The point was that the existence of that useless decoy option made people choose the most expensive bundle, because it suddenly looked smart. Remove the decoy and everyone went back to the cheaper option. The third choice didn't need to be chosen to change behavior. It only had to exist. That's when Ariely realized something unsettling. Most choices are not shaped by what we want, but by what we are shown. We don't evaluate options. We compare frames. A cup of coffee isn't expensive or cheap on its own. It becomes expensive or cheap compared to whatever sits next to it: a bigger coffee, a luxury drink, a printed price crossed out in red. People don't know what something is worth, so they let the environment decide. That's not stupidity. That's design. Our brains evolved to compare, not calculate. And if comparison is the silent puppeteer behind most decisions, then price isn't the only thing it manipulates. Pain, morality, behavior, and even physical sensation bend under its influence. Ariely proved this again when he tested how expectation can literally rewrite experience. Participants were given beer, some ordinary, some secretly mixed with a few drops of vinegar. When people tasted it without knowing the ingredients, many said the vinegar beer was richer, more complex, even pleasant. But when they were told before tasting it, disgust took over before the drink ever hit their tongue. Nothing about the beer changed. Only the story did, and the story overpowered the senses. The mind doesn't wait for reality. It prepares for it. And once it prepares, the body follows. The same truth appeared in a study on painkillers. 2 groups were given identical pills, fake medicine, completely inactive. One group was told the pill was expensive, the other was told it was cheap. The bodies of the expensive pill group released more natural painkillers. Not because the pill worked, but because the belief worked. Expectation isn't a reaction. It's a force. That's when Ariely realized something bigger. Most of what we call experience isn't happening in the world. It's happening in the mind before the world arrives. But irrationality didn't just show up in what we buy, value, or feel. It also took over something most people think they're in full control of: ethics. In one experiment, participants were paid based on how many math problems they solved. They graded their own papers and could lie for more money. Most people cheated, but just a little. Not enough to feel like criminals, but enough to benefit. But when a single person in the room cheated openly and got away with it, cheating spread rapidly. Not because the math changed, but because the moral atmosphere did. People don't ask, "Is this right?" They ask, "Is this normal?" Cheating didn't rise because people became greedier. It rose because the justification barrier fell. If everyone else is doing it, the self-image stays clean. We don't protect truth. We protect identity. The same pattern appeared in another experiment where people could earn either money or tokens which could later be exchanged for money. People cheated more when earning tokens. The more distance between the action and the reward, the weaker the guilt. That is the psychology behind corporate scandals, digital theft, and why someone who would never steal cash might download pirated content without a second thought. The brain doesn't feel wrongness in numbers. It only feels wrongness in faces. That's when Ariely understood something critical. Irrationality doesn't only twist logic. It twists morality, memory, judgment, and identity, but always in ways that feel perfectly justified. We don't know we're bending truth. We think we're balancing it. And maybe the most shocking part of all, the people in the experiments didn't walk away thinking, "I was irrational today." They walked away believing they were being sensible, even clever. That was the real danger. The mind doesn't notice its own distortion. Ariely wasn't just collecting data anymore. He was uncovering something deeper, a psychological operating system that works beneath awareness, beneath logic, beneath intention. And the more he uncovered, the more it became obvious. Humans don't choose randomly or intelligently. They choose predictably. And once something is predictable, it can be shaped by marketers, governments, systems, teachers, leaders, or by the person who finally sees the pattern. The journey into irrationality wasn't about judgment. It was about illumination. By now, the pattern was clear. People didn't just make irrational decisions, they made them repeatedly, consistently, confidently, and with the full belief that they were being reasonable. The mind didn't feel confused during these moments. It felt correct. And that was the most dangerous illusion of all. Irrationality doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as logic. But Ariely wanted to understand a deeper layer of it, not just what people choose, but who they become when emotion enters the equation. Because if comparison, ownership, price, and expectation can distort reasoning, what happens when the force isn't subtle but biological? What happens when the brain is flooded with desire, fear, adrenaline, or anticipation? That question led to one of the most unsettling experiments Ariely ever conducted, one he later admitted even made him uncomfortable. He asked young men a series of moral and behavioral questions while they were calm, and then asked them the same questions again when they were sexually aroused. These were not harmless questions. They involved consent, manipulation, cheating, and risky behavior. The results were not a mild shift, they were a moral landslide. The same men who, while calm, swore they would never pressure a partner, cheat on someone they cared about, or take reckless risks, answered almost the opposite when aroused. Their beliefs didn't bend, they collapsed. The rational self and the emotional self were not the same person. And that's when another truth surfaced. Self-control isn't a shortage of willpower. It is a mismatch of timing. We make promises in one emotional state and expect ourselves to honor them in another. The future self, who will go to the gym, refuse the dessert, avoid the temptation, save the money, stay loyal, that self exists only in the calm clarity of planning, not in the heat of the moment where decisions are actually made. The brain has two clocks, one that imagines and one that acts, and they almost never tick in sync. That same divide showed up in procrastination. Students were given a long-term assignment. One group set their own deadlines. The second group was given a strict schedule. The third had no deadlines at all until the final due date. Who performed the best? Not the ones with full freedom. Not even the ones with full structure. The winners were the ones who could choose their own checkpoints, creating boundaries that forced their future selves into action. Freedom without structure doesn't create discipline. It creates delay. This is why people wait until the last day to file taxes, clean the house right before guests arrive, and suddenly become productive when a deadline breathes down their neck. Logic doesn't move us, pressure does. Even effort itself reshaped value in ways no economist could explain. In another experiment, participants were given flat furniture from IKEA, asked to assemble it themselves, and then asked how much they would pay to keep what they built. The answer? Far more than its market worth. The more effort people invested, the more love they felt, not because the object improved but because identity was poured into it. This is what Ariely called the IKEA Effect. We don't just value what we own, we value what we struggle to own. Effort is not a cost. It is a love chemical. The same bias explains why people defend failing projects they've worked on, refuse to end relationships they've poured years into, and feel more loyal to ideas they've sacrificed for than ideas that made life easier. Pain turns into meaning. Struggle turns into pride. Investment turns into blindness. The mind doesn't ask, is this good? It asks, did I build this? Did I choose this? Did I suffer for this? And if the answer is yes, logic steps aside and emotion guards the door. Ariely began to see the brain not as a calculating machine, but as a story machine. Every choice becomes part of a narrative, and once the story forms, the mind protects it, even if it hurts us. We don't like being wrong, so we reshape truth until we're right. We don't live in reality. We live in meaning wrapped around reality. And yet, the most disturbing part wasn't any single bias, it was what all of them meant together. We are irrational not by accident, but by design. Our brains are engineered for shortcuts, emotion, ego protection, and social survival, not logic. And once you see that, something else comes into focus. Irrationality doesn't make us weak. It makes us predictable. Predictable enough to be manipulated. Predictable enough to be marketed to. Predictable enough to be controlled by defaults and pricing and frames and narratives. Predictable enough that the world already uses our psychology against us, long before we ever learn how it works. But predictable also means possible to intercept, if we learn to see the pattern in time. The next layer of Ariely's journey wasn't just about proving irrationality. It was about learning to hack it. Because once you recognize the script, you no longer have to play the character written for you. Ariely once said that studying human behavior was like holding up a mirror people didn't want to look into. Because once you see the reflection clearly, you realize how little of your life has ever been guided by pure logic. You start noticing how restaurants design menus to steer your eyes, how supermarkets use scent to slow your steps, how limited offers twist urgency into impulse. Every corner of modern life has become an echo of the same psychological levers he'd uncovered in his lab. Only here they're polished and monetized. And yet, he didn't study irrationality to accuse or condemn. He studied it to understand how the invisible machinery of choice could be reshaped, because if our instincts can be exploited, they can also be protected. One of his favorite examples came from something as boring as defaults. When countries asked citizens to register as organ donors, participation rates varied wildly. In some nations, nearly everyone signed up. In others, almost no one did. But culture, religion, or generosity had nothing to do with it. The difference was just one small checkbox. In countries where the form said, "Check this box to join the program," few people bothered. In countries where it said, "Check this box if you do not want to join," almost everyone stayed enrolled. The decision to save a life, one of the most profound moral acts imaginable, came down to whether the default button was left empty or filled. It wasn't that people didn't care. It was that people didn't choose. The path of least resistance became the path of moral outcome. That simple discovery changed the way Ariely saw responsibility. We think willpower shapes destiny. But in truth, design shapes destiny. The environment decides what's easy, and the human brain obeys ease. The less friction, the more likely an action feels like choice. So the real question isn't what do people want, but what do we make effortless? He saw this again in the world of effort and meaning. People hate tedious work, until they believe it matters. In an experiment nicknamed the Lego study, participants built small Lego figures for money. In one version, their creations were kept intact at the side of the table. In another, each finished figure was immediately disassembled in front of them, only to be rebuilt again. Same pay, same labor. But the difference was emotional gravity. Those who saw their work destroyed lost motivation instantly, quitting far sooner. The others kept going. The lesson was painful and universal. Meaning isn't optional, it's fuel. The human mind doesn't run on logic. It runs on purpose. Remove purpose and even reward loses flavor. That insight reached deeper than economics. It whispered something about why people stay in miserable jobs, toxic relationships, and failing projects, because as long as meaning seems present, the pain feels earned. We'd rather suffer with purpose than succeed in emptiness. And just as pain turns meaningful when wrapped in story, suffering turns addictive when wrapped in identity. Ariely saw how ownership, effort, and struggle merge into the same illusion. If I gave this part of myself, it must be valuable. It's the same logic behind the sunk cost fallacy. The reason gamblers keep betting, lovers keep hoping, and dreamers keep investing in something that's already broken. Rationally, they should walk away. Emotionally, they can't. We are built to protect what we've poured ourselves into. Even if it destroys us. Ariely began calling this the cost of caring, that invisible emotional tax attached to commitment. But even this, he realized, could be turned into strength. Because if people love what they build, then helping them build the right things could guide behavior toward better outcomes. Self-interest and social good didn't have to fight. They could be designed to cooperate. Still, beneath the data and discoveries, one idea haunted him. Awareness alone wasn't enough. People can know they're being manipulated and still fall for it. The free sticker still lights up pleasure centers in the brain. Anchors still tilt judgment. Ownership still inflates value. Knowledge doesn't erase bias, it just gives it a name. But maybe naming it was the beginning of control. Because the only defense against invisible influence is to make it visible. So Ariely kept pushing the mirror closer, showing how markets, governments, and even relationships are structured around the same psychological loops. The question was no longer whether we are irrational. That had been answered. The question was whether we could ever build a world that accepts that truth, and stops pretending that logic is our default state. The deeper he went, the more one thought echoed in his mind. If the systems around us are built for rational humans and rational humans don't exist, then maybe it's not the people who are broken. Maybe it's the systems. The more Ariely uncovered, the clearer the real problem became. It wasn't that people were irrational, it was that the world was designed for a species that doesn't exist. Economists built models assuming humans make decisions by weighing logic and benefit. Policymakers assumed people choose what's best for them. Businesses assumed customers think carefully before purchasing. But in every experiment, every real-world test, Ariely found the same truth. People don't make decisions based on logic. They make decisions based on emotion, convenience, story, habit, and bias, and then they defend those decisions with logic later. The mind acts first. Reason comes after, as a narrator, not a driver. Nothing exposed that more clearly than what happened when people broke rules, not criminal rules but personal ones. In another experiment, participants were given the chance to cheat for money. They didn't steal everything they could. They stole just enough to feel clever, not corrupt. They wanted the benefit but not the guilt. That's when Ariely discovered something strange. People don't want to be honest. They want to feel honest. And the mind is incredibly skilled at working around guilt. Borrow a pen? Everyone does it. Download a movie illegally? Studios are rich anyway. Lie about a small tax number? The government wastes money. Keep change the cashier miscounted? Not my fault. The brain bends reality to protect identity. We don't cheat to be evil. We cheat to stay good in our own story. But the most powerful part of that discovery was not the cheating itself. It was the trigger. When someone in the room cheated openly, others began to cheat more. Not because the reward increased but because the justification barrier dropped. Cheating didn't become profitable, it became permissible. We don't just copy behavior. We copy permission. That same force fuels everything from office culture to political corruption to viral trends. A single person bends a rule, and suddenly the room bends with them. If irrationality is contagious, then so is morality. And if meaning can motivate behavior, so can emptiness. He proved this in what became known as the Shredder experiment. Participants were paid for solving puzzles. After finishing, they shredded their answer sheets, meaning no one could verify the score. Cheating rose. But then Ariely added one tiny difference. Instead of shredding the sheets completely, the machine only destroyed the top half, leaving the answers visible. Suddenly, cheating dropped. The illusion of accountability, not actual accountability, was enough to change behavior. Humans don't need rules to act better. They need reminders that they're being watched, even symbolically. That's the same reason people litter less when there are eyes painted on a wall, or steal less when a fake security camera blinks. The mind doesn't obey reality. It obeys perceived reality. And yet, the real heartbreak wasn't in the experiments. It was in what they implied. Every part of society built on the assumption of rationality, law, economics, education, healthcare, politics, was balancing on an illusion. Systems weren't failing because humans were bad. Systems were failing because humans were never built to function inside them as imagined. We think people save money because it's smart. We think people eat healthy because it's logical. We think people follow rules because they're moral. We think people choose fairly because it's right. But logic is not the force driving behavior. Structure is. Identity is. Emotion is. Ease is. Norms are. And the moment Ariely accepted that, something shifted. The goal was no longer to fix people, but to fix the environments people live inside. Don't expect discipline, design defaults that make discipline unnecessary. Don't rely on honesty, remove the justifications that make cheating feel harmless. Don't preach long-term thinking. Build systems where short-term decisions automatically lead to long-term benefit. Don't trust willpower, assume it will fail and design around the failure. Because the brain isn't weak. It's predictable. And anything predictable can be redesigned. That's when Ariely's work stopped being research and became a quiet revolution, a blueprint for a world that doesn't demand rationality, but accommodates humanity. The next stage wasn't about proving irrationality anymore. It was about learning how to outsmart it. Once Ariely stopped trying to fight irrationality and started designing with it, everything changed. Instead of blaming people for choosing badly, he asked a different question. What if the choice itself is the problem? What if temptation isn't a character flaw, but a design flaw? What if procrastination isn't laziness, but a predictable response to how the brain balances pain and reward? What if bad decisions aren't truly decisions at all, but automatic defaults triggered by an environment built for logic, not humans? That shift in thinking unlocked something powerful. Irrationality wasn't the enemy, unconscious irrationality was. He proved this again when studying how people save money. Financial experts lecture endlessly, plan early, invest wisely, think long-term. But nothing changes. Not because people don't understand, but because the brain doesn't feel the future. The reward is too distant, the sacrifice too immediate. But when companies switched from "you must sign up for your retirement plan" to "you are automatically enrolled unless you opt out," participation skyrocketed. Not because employees became smarter, but because the default changed. One checkbox did what decades of advice never could. Human nature didn't evolve. The system evolved around it. The same principle worked in health behavior, charity, energy saving, even food consumption. When fruit is placed at eye level and junk food is slightly harder to reach, people eat differently, not because they changed their beliefs, but because the path of least resistance shifted. When automatic reminders replace willpower, people remember deadlines. When social proof replaces instruction, people imitate instead of debating. When rules are visible, not buried, people follow them. The brain is not stubborn, it is programmable. And then came one of the most revealing discoveries of all, the illusion of control. People roll dice harder when they want higher numbers. They press elevator buttons repeatedly even though they don't speed anything up. They feel safer driving than flying because sitting behind a wheel feels like agency, even when statistics scream otherwise. In casinos, gamblers throw money faster when they personally deal the cards, even though the deck doesn't care who touches it. We don't crave control over outcomes. We crave the feeling of control. Take that feeling away and anxiety rises. Give it, even artificially, and people will risk more, wait longer, endure harder things. That's why progress bars calm us. Why loading screens make us angrier than waiting in silence. Why buttons that do nothing still get pushed. The mind prefers false control over none. But the moment you see that illusion clearly, the world starts to bend in new directions. You begin noticing how companies manufacture the feeling of choice. Customize your burger, build your own playlist, select your own loan plan, personalize your color, even when all choices lead to the same place. Options don't always give freedom. Sometimes they disguise manipulation. Ariely understood then that modern life doesn't just exploit irrationality. It choreographs it. The real danger isn't that people make flawed decisions. It's that the world knows exactly how to trigger those flaws. But here's the quiet truth running beneath all of this. Irrationality isn't always destructive. It can be beautifully human. The same brain that overpays for its own handmade bookshelf also falls more deeply in love with what it builds, protects relationships it invests in, fights hardest for causes it suffered to defend. Illogical? Maybe. But meaningful? Absolutely. The line between weakness and wisdom is thinner than it appears. Effort creates attachment. Emotion creates memory. Story creates value. Expectation creates experience. Identity creates loyalty. These are not errors. They are human architecture. And once we see them clearly, we stop asking, why don't people act logically? And start asking, how can logic serve the way people actually are? At that point, Ariely's mission stopped being about exposing flaws. It became about engineering environments where irrationality works in our favor. Not a world where humans become rational. A world where being human doesn't sabotage us. But before that world could exist, there was one final insight left to uncover. One that didn't live in data, pricing, emotion, or choice, but inside the thing we guard most fiercely, our sense of self. Because the biggest illusion of all wasn't about money, pain, happiness, or morality. It was the belief that we are the ones in control of our own minds. Up until this point, the experiments had revealed how irrationality shapes the way we spend, value, cheat, remember, obey, resist, and even feel pain. But there was one final layer, the one people defend most, protect most, and question least, the self. The inner voice that says, I know why I do what I do. I make my own choices. I understand myself. That voice feels undeniable. Feels like truth. But Ariely discovered something far more unsettling. The self is not a single, stable thinker. It is a shifting negotiation between impulses, identities, emotions, and memories, and most of the time, the real decision maker is invisible, acting first while the conscious mind invents explanations afterward. One of the clearest proofs of this came from the happiness prediction problem. People were asked what would make them happy: more money, a bigger house, a dream car, a perfect job. They answered with confidence. Then they got those things. And the happiness spike lasted days, weeks at best. Then the brain reset itself. The extraordinary became normal. Desire resurfaced. A new upgrade became the next finish line. The mind didn't fail at happiness, it failed at predicting happiness. We think happiness is a destination. The brain treats it like a moving target. We tell ourselves we want success, but what we really want is the feeling of winning. We tell ourselves we want freedom but then feel lost without structure. We chase novelty, and the moment novelty becomes familiar we label it boring, and look for another hit. Not because we are broken but because we are wired for contrast, not contentment. The mind doesn't record life in raw events. It records differences. And the biggest difference of all, the one that defines identity, is the story we tell ourselves about who we are. But that story is more fragile, more biased, more sculpted by emotion than anyone wants to admit. Ariely saw this in a small but revealing study involving physical pain. Participants were asked to place their hands in painfully cold water for a set amount of time. In one version, the water was removed immediately after the timer. In another, the cold period lasted the same length, but continued with slightly less cold water for a few extra seconds. Objectively, the second version involved more total pain. But when asked which they preferred, people chose the longer trial. Why? Because the ending was less painful, and the ending shaped the memory. The mind doesn't remember experiences by duration. It remembers peaks and endings. That's why a breakup remembered badly can rewrite an entire relationship. Why the last day of a trip matters more than the trip. Why the memory of pain becomes worse than the pain itself, or better. Memory isn't truth. Memory is edited feeling. And once you understand that, something shatters. The self we believe in, the one who remembers clearly, decides logically, acts consistently, doesn't exist in the way we imagine. There are multiple versions of us, filtered through emotion, state, context, hormones, exhaustion, hunger, fear, ego, pressure, and time. The self who plans and the self who acts are not the same. The self who feels pain and the self who remembers pain are not the same. The self who promises and the self who breaks the promise are not enemies, they simply never meet. The mind is not a single narrator. It is a rotating cast that never shares the script. But here is the strange mercy buried inside that truth. If the self is not fixed, it is not doomed. If identity is built from patterns, then it can be rebuilt. If decisions are predictable, they can be redesigned. If irrationality is a map, not chaos, then awareness can draw a new route. Which leads to the final realization, the one Ariely reached after years of experiments, injuries, observations, and uncomfortable human truths. The goal is not to become perfectly rational. The goal is to become consciously irrational, aware of the patterns, awake inside the illusion, capable not of erasing bias, but of steering around it. Because once you can see the strings, the puppet is no longer helpless. The final question isn't, why do we think irrationally? It is, now that we know, what will we do with it? And that answer, the one that turns knowledge into power, awareness into control, design into freedom, waits in the conclusion. In the end, Ariely's work didn't lead to a grand message about fixing humanity, purifying thought, or eliminating bias. It led somewhere quieter and far more honest. To the realization that irrationality isn't a flaw to defeat, but a force to understand. We don't need to become perfectly logical beings. We need to stop being unconsciously driven by the same invisible loops over and over again. Because the tragedy isn't that we're irrational. The tragedy is that we believe we're not. Once you accept that the mind is built from shortcuts, emotional echoes, and survival-era assumptions, a strange kind of freedom appears. You stop expecting logic to save you. You stop blaming yourself for having impulses, temptations, doubts, contradictions. You stop believing every thought is a truth, every feeling is a message, every desire is a decision. And in that space the real work begins. Not changing human nature, but designing with it. You put the healthy choice closer, not the unhealthy one further. You make saving automatic instead of optional. You turn goals into structure, not promises. You remove the decoys that manipulate and replace them with defaults that guide. You build systems that reduce temptation before willpower is required. You stop arguing with emotion and instead, give emotion a path that leads somewhere better. You stop trying to be stronger next time, because you finally understand the truth. The mind doesn't fail in the moment of choice. The mind fails in the moment before design. And once you see that, the world stops looking like a battlefield of decisions, and starts looking like a blueprint waiting to be adjusted. Because irrationality can steal from us when ignored, but it can serve us when anticipated. It can destroy value when unconscious, but create meaning when shaped. It can justify cheating, but also deepen attachment, identity, and love. The same brain that falls for a decoy offer also falls in love with what it builds. The same bias that makes us overvalue what we own also makes us fiercely loyal to what we protect. The same instinct that pushes us toward free also pushes us to give when nothing is rewarded. We are not broken machines. We are emotional builders, predictable, imperfect, meaning-driven, story-shaped. Ariely's journey didn't end with the conclusion that humans are irrational. It ended with the understanding that we are predictably irrational, and therefore improvable. Not through lectures, not through logic, but through awareness plus design. Once you know the bias, you can plan for the bias. Once you see the force, you can redirect the force. Once you recognize the illusion, you don't have to live inside it. Rationality is not the absence of bias. Rationality is the presence of awareness. And maybe that is the real upgrade the human mind has been waiting for. Not perfection, not control, but the ability to pause, to question, to reframe, to design, to recognize the hidden patterns and say, I see the strings now, and I am no longer pulled by them blindly. Because the moment irrationality becomes visible, It stops being fate. And somewhere, years before the research, before the lectures, before the experiments, a boy lay in a hospital bed learning that pain wasn't just pain, it was expectation, timing, psychology. The nurses pulled the bandages fast, believing it was kinder. His skin burned, but the memory burned deeper. They weren't wrong because they were cruel. They were wrong because they trusted logic over experience. That was the first illusion he ever saw. And the moment he saw it, the world changed. Not because pain disappeared, but because the hidden force behind it finally had a name. That is the gift of awareness. It doesn't remove the bandage. It lets you choose how it's pulled.